Imagine looking up into the morning sky and seeing over 100 enemy planes coming straight for you, each one flown by a pilot who knows he won't be coming back. This isn't a movie. This was March 1945, and what followed would become the most decisive air battle of the Pacific War. Over the next 3 days, American pilots would face a storm of kamikazes, overwhelming odds, and a sky filled with fire. But what happened in those skies didn't just change the course of a battle, it crushed Japan's air power once and for all. This is the story of how a handful of U.S. Navy aviators turned the tide of war and why their victory mattered more than anyone could have imagined. They sent every plane they had into the sky, and we cut them down without hesitation. On the morning of March 18, 1945, wave after wave of Japanese fighters and bombers came at us like a swarm of hornets whose nest had just been kicked. I was Lieutenant Commander Jack Skipper Morrison, piloting an F-6 F-5 Hellcat with Squadron VF17, the well-known Jolly Rogers launched from the USS Hornet as part of Task Force 58. Beneath us stretched the lush green islands of the Ryukyu chain, and above, one of the largest air battles I'd ever witnessed was about to break out. The Japanese were making a final all-out effort to defend Okinawa, pulling in every operational aircraft they had from Kyushu to Formosa, but instead of pushing us back, they flew right into a massacre that would cost them over 500 aircraft. In just 3 days, that morning, tension gripped the briefing room aboard the Hornet. Commander David McCampbell, our air group leader and the Navy's highest-scoring ace with 34 confirmed kills, stood before the gathered pilots. Behind him, intelligence officers had tacked up aerial photos showing Japanese airfields packed with planes across the Ryukyu Islands. "This is the moment," McCampbell said with firm authority. "Task Force 58 is about to carry out the biggest carrier-based airstrike of the entire Pacific campaign. Admiral Mitcher wants every Japanese plane in these islands wiped out. Before we move on, Okinawa next month. Intel believes there are more than 800 enemy planes scattered from Kyushu to He tapped a point on the map with a stick. "They've been hoarding these aircraft for months, preparing for our next offensive. You'll see everything. Zeros, Tojos, Franks, Jacksivon, some newer interceptors. But here's what matters. Of their seasoned pilots are gone. What you'll face are kids, barely trained, with maybe 50 hours in the cockpit, going up against the finest naval aviators in the world." 19-year-old Lieutenant Bobby Chen, the youngest among us, raised a hand. "What about suicide attacks, sir?" McCampbell's face darkened. "Be ready for them. Japan has gone all-in on kamikaze tactics. Assume every enemy plane you encounter today is a potential suicide attacker. No games, no heroics. Take them out fast and clean." I looked at my watch. 5:30 a.m. in just half an hour. We'd be airborne, kicking off what would become the largest naval air assault in history. Around me, 48 pilots from VF17 readied themselves. Some scribbled quick letters home, others made last checks on their belts of .50 caliber rounds. A few just sat silently, staring at the deck, lost in thought. My Hellcat, tail number 47, was armed with 6.50 caliber guns and loaded with 2,400 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary bullets. Its Pratt & Whitney R280O double Wasp engine packed 2,000 horsepower and could push the plane to 380 miles per hour. Most importantly, it could take heavy damage and still get me home, something no Japanese fighter could match. At 6 a.m., the first wave took off. 16 fast carriers stretched out over 30 miles of open ocean began hurling aircraft into the dim morning sky. Hellcats, Corsairs, Helldiver bombers, and Avenger torpedo planes all rose in tight coordination. The sound was overwhelming, hundreds of engines rumbling in unison, their combined roar echoing for miles. My group was in the second wave, lifting off at 6:30. As I rolled down the Hornet's deck, I saw the earlier flights already organizing in the distance, their position lights twinkling against the early gray sky. The deck officer signaled go. I slammed the throttle forward and felt the jolt as the catapult hurled my 7-ton fighter into the air. Our rendezvous was precise. Within 20 minutes, 72 planes from the Hornet had assembled in tight formation. Nearby, similar squadrons from other carriers were taking shape. By 7 a.m., over 300 attack and fighter aircraft were moving northwest toward the Ryukyus, with a second wave of equal size trailing us by 30 minutes. It took just over an hour to reach our target. As we neared the southern part of the islands, I spotted columns of smoke rising from enemy airfields, evidence the first wave had already struck. Then, my radio came alive with the words I was expecting. "Bandits, bandits, this is Blue Leader. We've got contacts at 2 o'clock high, climbing fast." I glanced to my upper right, and a chill ran through me. Dozens of enemy fighters were ascending from runways across the islands, more than I'd ever seen in the air at once. Zeros, Tojos, Oscars, and several unfamiliar types swarmed upward to intercept us. "This is Jolly Roger Leader," came Mick Campbell's voice. Calm as ever. "They're coming. Hellcats, drop tanks and get ready. Strike formations, proceed with your objectives. We'll handle the skies." I dropped my external fuel tanks and armed my guns. The rest of the squadron followed suit. The enemy fighters kept trying to climb above us, but we already had the advantage 5,000 feet higher. "Tao-Leo," shouted Lieutenant Tom Bradley. 0 at 11 o'clock. Coming fast, suddenly the sky turned into a chaotic battlefield. Japanese fighters closed in from every direction. But something was clear, right away these weren't veteran flyers. Their formations were loose, their attacks unorganized, and their flying sloppy. I dove toward to Zeros, climbing toward our level. The lead pilot saw me coming and tried to bank away, but he turned toward my line of fire instead of away. I aimed, waited for him to fill my sights, and fired. My 6 machine guns lit up in unison, the noise deafening inside my cockpit. I watched my rounds tear across the enemy plane's fuselage, then punch into the engine. Smoke poured from the aircraft as it rolled and spiraled down toward the ocean in flames. I didn't have time to watch him hit the water. His wingman was already turning to attack. But this pilot was even less experienced. Instead of using his Zero's agility to gain the upper hand, he made a straight pass toward me at high speed. A fatal mistake. My Hellcat was built for moments like this. We closed fast over 600 miles an hour combined. I held my fire until he filled my view, then let loose a 3-second burst. The Zero shattered in midair. Pieces of metal, scattering. Like leaves in a storm, the pilot had no chance to escape. "Scratch another Zero," I reported over the radio, scanning for more enemies. The sky around me was alive with one-on-one fights. Hellcats and Corsairs tore through the enemy with brutal precision. Everywhere I looked, Japanese planes were dropping in flames or exploding in the sky. The radio channels were bursting with activity pilots shouting out enemy sightings, kill confirmations, and urgent warnings. Someone on my left shouted that a Frank was chasing him. Another voice quickly responded, spotting him and telling him to veer right. Someone else yelled that they'd just taken down a Tojo, his third of the day. A frantic warning followed, about a kamikaze diving toward our Helldiver group. I caught sight of the enemy aircraft, a Zero in a sharp descent aimed at our bombers. But before I could respond, 2 Corsairs from VF-84 swooped in and intercepted it. The enemy plane erupted. In flames, roughly 2,000 feet above the ocean's surface, the fight in the sky carried on for half an hour. Japanese pilots continued launching from airstrips across the islands, only to be thrown into a deadly trap. American aviators, many with extensive combat experience, were dismantling inexperienced Japanese flyers who were barely qualified to be in the cockpit. During that engagement, I downed 2 more Zeros and damaged a Tojo before the sky finally began to settle. By 9 a.m., whatever Japanese planes were left were either fleeing northward or attempting to land at airfields not yet hit. Commander Mick Campbell's voice came over the radio, instructing fighter groups to regroup for damage evaluation while attack squadrons continued pressing their targets. As we reformed, the destruction on the ground was clear. The Hellcat and Avengers had devastated every airstrip they hit. Fires raged across runways. Fuel tanks were exploding. Hangars had been flattened, and many enemy aircraft were still burning, ever having left the ground. Compared to the chaos we'd just survived, the flight back to the fleet felt almost serene. My Hellcat had taken some fire several rounds, had punched through my left wing, and one had cracked my canopy, but the plane was still flying strong. As we neared the carriers, I could see planes from other groups already touching down. The flight decks were a blur of activity, with crews rushing to refuel and reload aircraft for the next wave. I brought my fighter down on the Hornet without any problems, despite the damage. As I rolled to a stop and taxied toward the designated area, my crew chief, aviation machinist's mate First Class Tony Kowalski, ran toward the plane for post-flight checks. "How'd it go, Skipper?" he called out as I climbed down. "We gave them hell, Tony," I said, removing my helmet. "Got for myself. Saw at least 20 others go down. The enemy air force in the Ryukyus has been crushed." That afternoon's debrief felt different from any I'd been part of during my 3 years in the Pacific. One by one, pilots reported multiple kills. Our squadron had racked up 43 confirmed enemy aircraft shot down, with just 2 planes damaged and not a single pilot lost. And we were only one part of the operation. As information came in from across Task Force 58, the numbers were staggering. On that single day, U.S. carrier-based aircraft had destroyed 161 enemy planes in the air and another 191 on the ground, 352 in total. Commander McCampbell addressed us with a look of quiet pride. "Gentlemen," he said, "you've just helped make today the most successful in the history of naval aviation. But we're not finished. Reports indicate the Japanese are flying in reinforcements from Kyushu and Formosa. Tomorrow, we do this all over again." March 19th brought even heavier fighting. Reinforcements had arrived, but they were mainly outdated. Trainers and obsolete fighters forced into frontline duty. The outcome was even more one-sided than before. I flew to sorties that day, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. In the first, I shot down 3 enemy planes, 2 Zeros, and an Oscar, bringing my total to 7 in 2 days. Our second mission was aimed at Japanese ships and coastal defenses, but we ran into yet another enemy fighter group. This time, it was clear that the pilots had barely any combat time. Some seemed to be flying in battle for the first time. I watched one Zero try to perform a loop during a skirmish, only to stall at the top and spiral straight into the sea. No one even fired at him. The destruction went on throughout the day. We burned through our ammunition faster than usual. There were simply too many targets. By sunset, Task Force 58 had eliminated another 208 enemy aircraft. In just 2 days, 560 Japanese planes had been destroyed. But March 20th would mark the peak of the fighting. Intelligence warned that Japan was preparing a final, desperate blow against the task force. Every aircraft still operational in southern Japan, and the Ryukyus was being directed into a massive kamikaze mission. That morning, the skies were clear, and still, as we launched our dawn patrols, I saw other carriers doing the same. Admiral Mitcher wasn't taking chances. By sunrise, over 200 fighters were in the air. At 7 a.m., the attack began. Radar picked up a huge number of incoming aircraft from the north. More than 100 enemy planes were headed toward us in what looked like a coordinated suicide mission. The fighter director's voice came over the airwaves. Big formation coming in from 060 degrees, 80 miles out, at 12,000 feet. All squadrons, vector and climb to intercept. I was leading a flight of 4 Hellcats when we made contact. The sight stopped me cold. Dozens of enemy planes spread out across the sky, all pointed directly at our ships. I could make out Zeros, Oscars, Tojos, and unfamiliar types, all flying with one purpose. As we got closer, I realized they weren't preparing for a fight. They were ignoring us, heading straight for the carriers. They're all kamikazes, I told my wingman. Every one of them's on a suicide mission. What followed was the most intense half-hour of air combat I'd ever experienced. American fighters were hitting the enemy formation from every angle, doing everything possible to bring them down before they could reach the fleet. The sky was filled with blazing wreckage, falling planes, and parachutes. That morning, I personally shot down 6 enemy aircraft. All Kamikaze. 2 were Zeros caught in a steep climb. Both exploded under heavy gunfire. The third, an Oscar, tried to escape in a dive but flew straight into my line of fire. The fourth and fifth were a pair of Tojos flying side by side. I took them both out with one long burst that ignited their fuel tanks. The sixth aircraft I brought down was a twin-engine bomber I didn't recognize. Likely a modified version of the Betty, loaded for a suicide run. Even though we did everything possible to stop them, a few kamikazes managed to break through. I watched in disbelief as a Zero plunged directly into the carrier, Franklin, setting off a massive explosion that sent fire and smoke billowing skyward. The Yorktown was also hit by a bomb, resulting in the deaths of 5 crew members and injuries to 26 others. Still, the overwhelming majority of the enemy assault was repelled by our fighter squadrons. When the skies finally cleared by around 8 a.m., we had brought down 67 out of roughly 100 enemy planes. The rest either retreated north or crashed into the sea after running out of fuel. With that, the 3-day aerial campaign over the Ryukyu Islands had concluded. Task Force 58 had secured full dominance of the air over the approaches to Okinawa. In just 3 days, carrier-based aircraft from the U.S. Navy had wiped out 5 to 8. Enemy planes 482 taken down by pilots and strike aircraft, and 46 destroyed by shipboard gunfire while parked on runways. Our own losses had been relatively small. 24 aircraft were shot down, and 2 carriers sustained damage from suicide attacks. But both the Franklin and the Yorktown remained operational. More importantly, the enemy's ability to contest the skies in that region had been shattered. When I stepped out of my Hellcat after completing my final sortie on March 20th, I was physically drained but filled with a deep sense of accomplishment. I had personally shot down 13 planes during the operation, making me the top-scoring pilot in our squadron for that campaign. More significantly, VF17 had brought down 86 enemy aircraft while losing only 3 of our own. Later that evening, Admiral Mitcher addressed the entire fleet over the ship's loudspeakers. His voice was steady and measured, but a note of pride was unmistakable. He told us we had just executed the most successful carrier-based airstrike in naval history. In 3 days, we had destroyed more than 500 enemy planes and eliminated Japan's ability to resist in the Ryukyus. Okinawa now lay ahead, and although the Japanese would still throw what they had at us, their air forces could no longer make a meaningful difference. Lying in my bunk that night, listening to the hum of engines and the sounds of the ship preparing for another day's work, I thought about what we had done. The Japanese had committed every plane they could get, airborne, every pilot they could find, every desperate tactic they could imagine, and we dismantled it all with discipline and precision. Their young aviators had shown courage, but courage alone was no match for superior machines. better preparation, and years of battlefield experience. Most of them had been flying only a short time. Our airmen, on the other hand, had been in combat for years. The outcome had never really been in question. That's what war is. After all, it's not about fairness. It's about achieving victory by destroying over 500 enemy aircraft in 72 hours. We had removed Japan's ability to defend its own skies in that part of the world. When we landed on Okinawa in April, the enemy had fewer than 200 planes left across the entire island chain, and by the time the fighting there ended in June, even those would be gone. I had been in this war since 1942 and had seen the evolution of U.S. naval aviation, firsthand from a small force to the most dominant in history. Early in the war, a single Japanese Zero could take on 3 of our fighters and hold its own. But by 1945, a trio of American pilots could wipe out an entire enemy squadron without suffering losses. The young men we fought over the Ryukyus had been thrown into a hopeless battle by their commanders in a last-ditch attempt to stop what couldn't be stopped. Japan had sealed its fate when it struck Pearl Harbor. It had just taken 4 long years for that reality to play out. The dogfights between March 18th and March 20th were not just a turning point. They were proof that Japan no longer had the power to defend itself from the air. As our task force turned back toward Ulithi Atoll to rearm and prepare for the next phase of the campaign, I stood on the flight deck watching the sun dip below the horizon. That same sun was setting over Japan, where leaders were likely trying to understand how they had lost so many aircraft in such a short time. The truth was simple. They had thrown everything into the sky, and we had cut it down. The airspace over the Western Pacific was now under American control, and that wouldn't change until the war ended 4 months later. Those enemy pilots who died in flaming wreckage had been someone's sons and brothers, just like we were. They had gone to war for their nation, as we had for ours. But they were sent into a slaughter by commanders who knew full well it was a lost cause. And that was the real tragedy, not simply that so many had died, but that their deaths achieved nothing. Their efforts hadn't slowed us down by even a single day. It had merely provided more targets for experienced pilots who had already become the finest in the world. As darkness settled over the ship, I went below deck to write letters to the families of the 3 VF17 pilots who hadn't returned. Tomorrow would bring more flights, more combat, and likely more names to add to the list. But tonight, our fleet ruled the skies, and those 500 enemy aircraft would never pose a threat again. In the cold calculus of modern war, that was